Good morning. This is Martin Comtois, MC Starman, with my friend Luke Renda, and we're doing C.G. Jung's Undiscovered Self, and we're up to chapter 5, the philosophical and the psychological approach to life. Um, we had really a good time. The last two there really detailed. So here we are. I'm going to start. It's a 9-page chapter, so we're going to try to do it all at one time. So here we go. Our ideas have, however, the unfortunate but inevitable tendency to lag behind the changes in the total situation. They can hardly do otherwise because so long as nothing changes in the world, they remain more or less adapted and therefore function in a satisfactory way. There is then no cogent reason why they should be changed and adapted anew. Only when conditions have altered so drastically that there is a unendurable rift between the outer situation and our ideas now become antiquated, does the general problem of our Weltanschauung or philosophy of life arise, and with it the question of how the primordial images that maintain the flow of instinctive energy are to be reoriented or readapted. They cannot simply be replaced by a new rational configuration, for this would be molded too much by the outward situation and not enough by man's biological needs. Moreover, not only would it build no bridge to the original man, but it would block the approach to him altogether. This is in keeping with the aims of Marxist education, which seeks, like God himself, to remake man, but in the image of the state.
Yeah, this one is again, he brings up the rational approach, which he's been kind of talking down the entire time, right? This sometimes the rational approach, it's the master and his emissary. It's the left brain and the right brain, right? Whereas the right brain is connected with imagination and creativity, and it's much older, the right brain, whereas the left brain is like compartmentalizing things. It's analyzing things. It's putting them in their sort of right place. But what happens is we become too rationalized, and it's just completely taken over, and we haven't been able to get back to the creative side and the older side of our brains. And it almost like it's self-censoring. This rational mind is like censoring anything that doesn't fit for it. And
Right.
yeah, that's really my only comment there. So I'll continue. Today, our basic convictions are becoming increasingly rationalistic. Our philosophy is no longer a way of life as it was in antiquity. It has turned into an exclusively intellectual and academic exercise. Our denominational religions, with their archaic rites and conceptions, justified enough in themselves, express a view of the world which caused no great difficulties in the Middle Ages, but has become strange and unintelligible to modern man. Despite this conflict with the modern scientific outlook, a deep instinct bids him hang on to ideas which, if taken literally, leave out of account all the mental developments of the last 500 years. The obvious purpose of this is to prevent him from falling into the abyss of nihilistic despair. But even when a rationalist even when, as a rationalist, he feels impelled to criticize denominational religion as literalistic, narrow-minded, and obsolescent. He should never forget that it proclaims a doctrine whose symbols, although their interpretation may be disputed, nevertheless possess a life of their own by virtue of their archetypal character. Consequently, intellectual understanding is by no means indispensable in all cases, but is called for only when evaluation through feeling and intuition does not suffice. That is to say, in the case of people for whom the intellect carries the prime power of conviction.
Wow. Yeah. So he says, first he says, that everything's fine for the person who hasn't really grown in himself till there's a major crisis. When there's a major crisis and everything falls apart, then that throws the individual into a state of having to redefine himself. And that's really what we're going through collectively right now. So this Weltanschauung, this philosophy of life, needs to be adapted to the changing situation. And because we don't have a connection with that inner self, we don't have a philosophy of life, and we just go with what society gives us, then because of that, when society goes into crisis, then we also go into crisis. And religion would offer us some help, but really religion has become really very much a creed, and it's not relevant. And so rationalistically, we're ready to throw it away. But then he says, well, really, we have to engage with it, because in religion, there is symbols that talk about this philosophy of life. It draws us inwards to engage with the archetypes and with the symbols and with the philosophy of life. So I'll keep going now. So nothing is more characteristic and symptomatic in this respect than the gulf that has opened between faith and knowledge. The contrast has become so enormous that one is obliged to speak of the incommensurability of these two categories and their way of looking at the world. And yet they are concerned with the same empirical world in which we live. For even the theologians tell us that faith is supported by facts that become historically perceptible in the known world of ours, namely that Christ was born as a real human being, worked many miracles, and suffered his fate, died under Pontius Pilate, and rose up in the flesh after his death. Theology rejects any tendency to take the assertion of its earliest records as written myths and accordingly to understand them symbolically. Indeed, it is the theologians themselves who have recently made the attempt, no doubt it is a concession to knowledge, to demythologize the French accent here, demythologize the object of their faith while drawing the line quite arbitrarily at the crucial points. But to the critical intellect, is it only too obvious that myth is an integral component of all religions and therefore cannot be excluded from the assertion of faith without injuring them.
Yeah, the myths, even though he wants us to kind of update our myths and our archetypal understanding. Our archetypes the symbols are changing, but the story is the same with the myths. Like if you read it 1,000 years ago or today, you're gonna get the same feeling out of it. You know what I mean? Like it's like when you reread a book, you're gonna get something new out of it, but the myth has stayed the same, and it's just a new meaning that you need to bring to it from our current times. And yeah, the demythologizing of it is just like, that's the beauty of it. They're trying to make it so rational and factual, which almost makes it more ridiculous, in my opinion. I'll continue. The rupture between faith and knowledge is a symptom of the split consciousness, which is so characteristic of the mental disorder of our day. It is as if two different persons were making statements about the same thing, each from his own point of view, or as if one person in two different frames of mind were sketching a picture of his existence. If for a person we substitute modern society, it is evident that the latter is suffering from a mental disassociation, i.e., a neurotic disturbance. In view of this, does not help matters at all if one party pulls obstinately to the right and the other to the left. This is what happens in every neurotic psyche. It is to its own deep distress, and it's just this distress that brings the patient to the analyst.
If society was able to go to the analyst would tell the society, you're dissociated, you're disconnected from the symbols and the instincts that make for your inner life. And that's what we work with the analysis, as we try to bring about an emergence of a philosophy of life. We try to give back the compass and the rudder to life, because we've become so brainwashed by society. We've lost our compass and we've lost our rudder, and we are adrift in the sea and dissociated as fuck. Oops. As I stated above in all brevity, while not neglecting to mention certain practical details whose omission might have perplexed the reader, and the analyst has to establish a relationship with both halves of his patient's personality, because only from them can he put together a whole and complete man, and not merely from one half by suppression of the other half. But this suppression is just what the patient has been doing all along. For the modern Weltanschauung leaves him with no alternative. His individual situation is the same in principle as the collective situation. He is a social microcosm reflecting on the smallest scale the qualities of society at large, or conversely, the smallest social unit cumulatively producing the collective dissociation. The later possibility is the more likely one, as the only direct and concrete carrier of life is the individual personality, while society and the state are conventional ideas and can claim reality only insofar as they are represented by a conglomeration of individuals.
Yeah, the repressing of one half to bring out the other half is exactly what we've been doing. And that's why we're having a resurgence of this psychosis. And it kind of goes to that Ian McGilchrist book, Master and His Emissary, whereas the master was the right brain that created the left brain to kind of be a tool that we could use to analyze things and quantify. But then it's all of a sudden now the emissary has taken over and has relegated this master to this sub position. And yeah, it's the whole master and his emissary thing. But it's the repressing of the shadow is what Jung is kind of getting at too here, I think. And I love that line where the smallest social unit cumulatively producing the collective disassociation. Absolutely amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Far too little attention has been paid to the fact that for all our irreligiousness, the distinguishing marks of the Christian epoch, its highest achievement has become the congenital vice of our age, the supremacy of the word of the Logos, which stands for the central figure of our Christian faith. The Word has literally become our God, and so it has remained, even if we know of Christianity only from hearsay. Words like society and state are so concretized that they are almost personified. In the opinion of the man in the street, the state, far more than any king in history, is the inexhaustible giver of all good. The state is invoked, made responsible, grumbled at, and so on and so forth. Society is elevated to the rank of a supreme ethical principle. Indeed, it is even credited with positively creative capacities. No one seems to notice that this worship of the Word, which was necessary at certain phases of man's mental development, has a perilous shadow side. That is to say, the moment the Word, as a result of centuries of education, attains universal validity, it severs its original connection with the divine person. There is then a personified church, a personified state. Belief in the world becomes credulity, and the Word itself an infernal slogan capable of any deception. With credulity come propaganda and advertising to dupe the citizen with political jobbery and compromises. And the lie reaches proportions never known before in the history of the world.
That's an incredible statement. Jung studied Christianity a lot, to try to understand the collective zeitgeist, and the logos, the greatest part of Christianity, which empowered us so much, is this rationalistic, connection with the Word being, one first, scripture, but then also just this rational thinking and what we expressing, and this empowering of the rationalistic part of the individual to the detriment of intuition and to the detriment of feeling. We have raised the intellect, and so then through the intellect we empower the state and we empower the church to become the Word, and then we become so entranced with the Word that we lose the connection with the divine, and then we just take the Word for everything. So now if it's printed, if it's said on the internet, it's true, and then that just reinforces the collective dissociation, because we've lost track of that second half of our personality, of which we see, the job of the analyst, the job of the healer, is to get the two sides of the personality to talk together and to become one. Wow, what fascinating ideas. Thus, the Word, originally announcing the unity of all man and their union in the figure of the one great man, has in our day become a source of suspicion and distrust of all against all. Credulity is one of our worst enemies, but that is the makeshift the neurotic always resorts to in order to quell the doubter in his own breast and to conjure him out of existence. People think you have only to tell a person that he ought to do something in order to put him on the right track. But whether he can or will do it is another matter. The psychologist has come to see as that nothing is achieved by telling, persuading, admonishing, giving good advice. He must acquaint himself with all the particulars and have an authentic knowledge of the psychic inventory of his patient. He has therefore to relate to the individuality of the sufferer and feel his way into all the nooks and crannies of his mind. To a degree that far exceeds the capacity of a teacher or even of a director of conscience. His scientific objectivity, which excludes nothing, enables him to see his patient not only as a human being, but also as an anthropoid who is bound to his body like an animal. His training directs his medical interests beyond the conscious personality to the world of unconscious instinct dominated by sexuality and the power drive or self-assertion, which correspond to the twin moral concept of St. Augustine, concupiscentia and superbia. The clash between these two fundamental instincts, preservation of the species and self-preservation, is the source of numerous conflicts. They are, therefore, the chief object of moral judgment, whose purpose is to prevent instinctual collisions as far as possible.
Yeah, he kind of brings up the stuff that he learned from Freud and Adler, right? With the sexual drive and then the power drive, right? That's Freud and Adler right there, which I think he covers in his earlier collective works. But back to the word again, this is what Ian McGilchrist says about the left and right brain. I keep bringing this up. I'll probably have to do a separate video on it. But whereas like we live so much in the word, we forget the actual thing. Like we've quantified it so much that now if something comes up from our right brain that doesn't fit with the left discriminating intellect, it just disregards it completely. And it's like, and when he it's like what's happening now in the world with our governments currently. There's probably 20 or 30 solutions that any reasonable person could think of to deal with our current crisis, not just with the mass psychosis now and the invisible viruses and whatever, but with any situation, our environment, our suicide rates, our drug addiction. There are many solutions, and these scientists just have a one-track mind and they only choose just one. But the credulity is the problem. It's like credulity is like gullibility. Like we're just too quick to believe them. And again, there's so many options, and with them, there's a myriad of options. And because our problems are so unique, and because our problems are, they're not just one size fits all. But that's what science has done. It's created this one size fits all model. And it's just, honestly, to any rational person, it's ridiculous, really. But it's the living in the word and not the actual situation. So I hope that makes sense. As I explained earlier, instinct has two main aspects. On the one hand, that of dynamism and compulsion, and on the other, specific meaning and intention. It is highly probable that all man's psychic functions have an instinctual foundation, as is obviously the case with animals. It is easy to see that in animals, instinct functions as the spiritus rector of all behavior. This observation lacks certainty only when the learning capacity begins to develop, for instance, in the higher apes and in man. In animals, as a result of their learning capacity, instinct undergoes numerous modifications and differentiations. In civilized man, the instincts are so split up that only a few of the basic ones can be recognized with any certainty in their original form. The most important are the two fundamental instincts already mentioned and their derivatives, and these have been the exclusive concerns of medical psychology so far. But in following up the ramifications of instinct, investigators came upon configurations which could not with certainty be ascribed to either group. To take but one example, the discoverer of the power instinct raised the question whether an apparently indubitable expression of the sexual instinct might not be better explained as a power arrangement. And Freud himself felt obliged to acknowledge the existence of ego instincts in addition to the overriding sexual instinct, a clear concession to the Adlerian standpoint. In view of this uncertainty, it is hardly surprising that in most cases, neurotic symptoms can be explained almost without contradiction in terms of either theory. This perplexity does not mean that one or the other standpoint is erroneous or that both are. Rather, both are relatively valid and, unlike certain one-sided and dogmatic tendencies, admit the existence and competition of still other instincts. Although, as I have said, the question of human instinct is a far from simple matter, we shall probably not be wrong in assuming that the learning capacity, a quality almost exclusive to man, is based on the instinct for imitation found in animals. It is in the nature of this instinct to disturb other instinctive activities and eventually to modify them, as can be observed, for instance, in the songs of birds when they adopt other melodies.
Well, and so this is profound. He talks about, the spiritus rector, and the other paragraph, he talks about the guide of conscience and what the role of the psychotherapist or the healer, to try to bring about the unity of the personality. And then goes into, the instinctual drive of one to self-assert oneself, the urge to power, the Adlerian view, and then the sexual Freudian view of procreation and sexual instinct being the base of everything. And then Jung introduces the instinct to become whole or to adapt to one's situation. And so, of course, Jung was going to talk about, as talked in the previous chapter about instincts as archetypes. So he's building a case and using, psychological basic ideas from his time. And now, this Adlerian and Freudian view, have even become really even more dumbed down than they were back then. And now we're, psychology is psychology without soul. There's no more soul. It's just the science of the mind, and there's no archetypes. There's no symbol. There's no mythology. It's just and so in a sense, these ideas, Freudian ideas and Adlerian ideas, are really not even talked about so much in our times anymore. And so then the reader must take the time to learn about Freud and Adler and Jung and the early works of psychoanalysis to try to really gain some insight into what he's talking about. But let's continue. Nothing estranges man more from the ground plan of his instinct than his learning capacity, which turns out to be a genuine drive for progressive transformation of human modes of behavior. I'm going to read that one again. Nothing estranges man more from the original ground plan of his instinct than his learning capacity, which turns out to be a general drive for progressive transformation of human modes of behavior. It, more than anything else, is responsible for the altered conditions of his existence and the need for new adaptation which civilization brings. It is also the ultimate source of numerous psychic disturbances and difficulties which are occasioned by man's progressive alienation from his instinctual foundation, namely by his uprootedness and identification with his conscious knowledge of himself, by his concern with consciousness at the expense of the unconscious. The result is that modern man knows himself only so far as he can become conscious of himself. a capacity largely dependent on environmental conditions, knowledge and control of which necessitated or suggested certain modifications of his original instinctive tendencies. His consciousness, therefore, orients itself chiefly by observing and investigating the world around him, and it is to the latter's peculiarities that he must adapt his psychic and technical resources. This task is so exacting and its fulfillment so profitable that he forgets himself in the process, losing sight of his instinctual nature and putting his own conception of himself in place of his real being. And this way he slips imperceptibly into a purely conceptual world where the products of his conscious activity progressively take the place of reality. I'll read that one again. In this way, he slips imperceptibly into a purely conceptual world where the products of his conscious activity progressively take the place of reality. Woo!
So by like analyzing the facts and by trying to intellectually understand the world around him, again, it's like he's put the words on the things so that we can discuss them. You know, this is a pine cone, this is a rock, this is whatever, so we can all talk about it. But then he's just like, he's forgotten the word. He's put the word in place of the actual thing itself. And he's done it so much so that he's forgotten his own self. And so it's like the word of himself is what he sees, not the real self. And further back in the paragraph, when he says that the chief objective of moral judgment, whose purpose is to prevent instinctual collisions as far as possible. So these instinctual collisions, that is like what we would have in society as like morality. When we become more and more civilized, we lose touch with our instincts, and without dealing with our unconscious, we basically become neurotic. And what's interesting is that people from third world countries who literally have nothing or living in a war-torn country, the suicide rate is so low. But when these people come to America, their suicide rate goes up infinitely because they're all of a sudden taken out of this instinctual world and put into a civilized world, and they become like disassociated. And then there's different existential troubles which they didn't really face in the jungle. And it's the fine balance between the two. It's not being a completely instinctual being, and it's not being completely intellectual, and it's that striking that balance which is going to keep us from being neurotic.
Right.
So I'll continue here. Separation from his instinctual nature inevitably plunges civilized man into the conflict between conscious and unconsciousness. All right, by conscious and unconscious, spirit and nature, knowledge and faith, a split that becomes pathological the moment his consciousness is no longer able to neglect or suppress his instinctual side. The accumulation of individuals who have got into this critical state starts off a mass movement purporting to be the champion of the suppressed. In accordance with the prevailing tendency of consciousness to seek the source of all ills in the outside world, the cry goes up for political and social changes which, it is supposed, would automatically solve the much deeper problems of split personality. Hence, it is that whenever this demand is fulfilled, political and social conditions arise which bring the same ills back again in altered form. What then happens is a simple reversal. The underside comes to the top, and the shadow takes the place of the light. And since the former is always anarchic and turbulent, the freedom of the liberated underdog must suffer draconian curtailment. The devil is cast out with Beelzebub. All is unavoidable because the root of the evil is untouched, and merely the counterposition has come to light.
Wow. So basically, he's describing the split in consciousness, that we think that what we think is reality, and we become so in love with our ideas that that has become the reality, and it's still so far from what actual reality is, because we disconnected from our instincts, we're disconnected from the archetypal world, and we think ideas are reality. And because of that, we empower these ideas, and then we go into conflicts, social conflicts. And so then what is really basically a state of neurotic dissociation in the individual, because he's completely one-sided on the side of the intellect and dissociated from his instinct, then he manufactures these conflicts in society, so that the neurotic individual, really, you can't separate it from his neurotic civilization. And so really, Jung is building the point, or building an understanding of the great split that was current at his time, and which can be experienced in our times as well, but with a different context. The communist revolution has debased man far lower than democratic collective psychology has done, because it robs him of his freedom, not only in the social, but in the moral, spiritual sphere. Aside from the political difficulties, this entailed a great psychological disadvantage to the West that had already made itself unpleasantly felt in the days of the German Nazism. We can now point a finger at the shadow. Aside from the political difficulties, this entailed a great psychological disadvantage for the West that had already made itself unpleasantly felt in the days of German Nazism. We can now point the finger at the shadow. He is clearly on the other side of the political frontier, while we are on the side of the good and enjoy the possession of the right ideals. Did not a well-known statement recently confess that he had no imagination for evil? In the name of the multitude, he was expressing the fact that Western man is in danger of losing his shadow altogether, of identifying himself with his fictive personality, and the world with the abstract picture painted by scientific rationalism. His spiritual and moral I got to do that sentence again. In the name of the multitude, he was expressing the fact that the Western man is in danger of losing his shadow altogether, of identifying himself with his fictive personality, and the world with the abstract picture painted by scientific rationalism. His spiritual and moral opponent, who is just as real as he, no longer dwells in his own breast, but beyond the geographical line of division, which no longer represents an outward political barrier, but splits off the conscious from the unconscious man more and more menacingly. Thinking and feeling lose their inner polarity, and where religious orientation has grown ineffective, not even a God can check the sovereign way of unleashed psychic functions. Wow.
Amazing, yeah. Well, it's like, again, it's like that enantiodromia, that one-sided ego stance is going to switch back into its opposite again. And that's amazing about that politician having no concept of evil. It's like, well, you're in the wrong job, buddy.
Well,
Irrational philosophy does not bother itself with whether the other person in us, pejoratively described as the shadow, is in sympathy with our conscious plans and intentions. Evidently, it still does not know that we carry in ourselves a real shadow whose existence is grounded in our instinctual nature. No one can overlook either the dynamism or the imagery of the instincts without the gravest injury to himself. Violation or neglect of instinct has painful consequences of a psychological and physiological nature, for whose treatment medical help, above all, is required.
So he's talking about the cause of psychosis, of neurosis, and then and then of course psychosis is only a step away from the collective neurosis of our time. And what causes that neurosis is that we're completely dissociated from our shadow. And we are completely unable to really connect with the instinctual side of our nature, so much so that we imagine the world to be something which it is not, and we disagree with those who don't agree with us, and we project our shadow upon them so that we have the mess that we have. And so the withdrawing of the projection and the honoring of the fact that I have a shadow, I have an instinctual nature, and I need to pay attention to it. I need to develop it so that I can become fully a human being, not just a half of a dissociated member of the society. You got to be impressed with Jung's ability to so so clearly describe the collective psychosis. And again, this was written 75 years ago.
Yeah, can I make one quick comment here?
Sure.
About that? You know how the politician said he has no evil, he doesn't have a concept of evil, and where he kind of says that the opponent no longer dwells in his own breast, but beyond this geographical line. It's like, again, this is what they're searching for, boogeymen all over the place. Now it's a sickness. Before it was terrorism. On and on it goes, because we can't face our own shadow within. We project it out there, and it's like basically sums up almost every politician we have today. It's absolutely wild, man.
Mm-hmm. For more than 50 years, we have known, or could have known, that there is an unconscious counterbalance to consciousness. Medical psychology has furnished all the necessary empirical and experimental proofs of this. There is an unconscious psychic reality which demonstrably influences consciousness and its contents. All this is known, but no practical conclusions have been drawn from this fact. We still go on thinking and acting as before, as if we were simplex and not duplex. Accordingly, we imagine ourselves to be innocuous, reasonable, and humane. We do not think of distrusting our motives or of asking ourselves, our own inner man, ourselves, how the inner man feels about the things we do in the outside world. But actually, it is frivolous, superficial, and unreasonable for us, as well as psychically unhygienic, to overlook the reaction and standpoint of the unconscious. One can regard one's stomach or heart as unimportant or worthy of contempt, but that does not prevent overeating or overexertion from having consequences that affect the whole man. Yet we think that psychic mistakes and their consequences can be got rid of with mere words, for psychic means less than air to most people. All the same, nobody can deny that without the psyche, there would be no world at all, and still less a human world. Virtually everything depends on the human psyche and its functions. It should be worthy of all the attention we can give it, especially today, when everyone admits that the weal or woe of the future will be decided neither by the threat of wild animals, nor by natural catastrophes, nor by the danger of worldwide epidemics, but simply and solely by the psychic changes in man. It needs only an almost imperceptible disturbance of equilibrium in a few of our rulers' heads to plunge the world into blood, fire, and radioactivity. And we could add flood to that. The technical means necessary for this are present on both sides, and certain conscious deliberations, uncontrolled by any other opponent, can be put into effect all too easily, as we have seen already with the example of one leader, mentioning Hitler here. The consciousness of modern man still clings so much to external objects that he makes them exclusively responsible, as if it were on them that the decision depended. That the psychic state of certain individual could ever emancipate itself from the behavior of objects is something that is considered far too little. Although irrationalities of this sort are observed every day and can happen to everyone.
Yeah, well, that's kind of like the human world. Because Jung was so influenced by German idealism, by Hegel and Schelling and Goethe, he talks about how this human world depends upon the psyche. The whole world depends upon the psyche. There wouldn't even be a world, so to speak, without the psyche. And so that's just so interesting. And then, yeah, when he talks about the epidemics and whatever, that's not the problem. The problem is coming from man. And if only a few of our world leaders show this type of neurosis and dissociation, we're going to be in for it. Well, look what's happened. Every country in the world, every leader in the world is freaking neurotic right now, and they're doing the same thing to try and solve the same problem. Whereas there, again, like I said before, there's a myriad of options. They just choose just one because that's what fits their rational model. And they're living in the word, not in reality, which they could see that their decisions that they're making right now in our current times are so detrimental to human beings. It's worse than what they're trying to suppress. The forlorn state of consciousness in our world is due primarily to loss of instinct, and the reason for this lies in the development of the human mind over the past aeon. The more power man had over nature, the more his knowledge and skill went to his head, and the deeper became his contempt for the merely natural and accidental. For all irrational data, including the objective psyche, which is everything that consciousness is not. In contrast to the subjectivism of the conscious mind, the unconscious is objective, manifesting itself mainly in the form of contrary feelings, fantasies, emotions, impulses, and dreams, none of which one makes oneself, but which come upon one objectively. Even today, psychology is still, for the most part, the science of conscious contents, measured as far as possible by collective standards. The individual psyche has become a mere accident, a marginal phenomenon, while the unconscious, which can manifest itself only in the real, irrationally given human being, has been ignored altogether. This was not the result of carelessness or of lack of knowledge, but of downright resistance to the mere possibility that there could be a second psychic authority beside the ego. It seems a positive menace to the ego that its monarchy could be doubted. The religious person, on the other hand, is accustomed to the thought of not being sole master of his own house. He believes that God, and not he himself, decides in the end. But how many of us would dare to let the will of God decide, and which of us would not feel embarrassed if he had to say how far the decision came from God himself?
Wow. Wow. I want to repeat the sentence. The more power man had over nature, the more his knowledge and skill went to his head, and the deeper became his contempt for the merely natural and accidental, for all irrational data, including the objective psyche, which is everything that consciousness is not. And so Jung really makes this point in terms of what causes the collective psychosis and the dissociation of modern man is his overemphasis on rationalistic ideas and his conscious picture of the world and his complete disrespect for the contents of the unconscious, for the mythology, for the instinctual side, for the natural side of man, and so that hubris of consciousness, this complete disregard for the unconscious. So basically, Jung is putting psyche back into psychology. And that is the greatest loss in Jungian psychology, not being included in the collective psychological narrative, is because we have completely lost this conception, and we're trying to cure the soul, and then now we just call it mental illness. We don't even see that they're psychic illnesses. Interesting times, huh? So the religious person, as far as one can judge, is directly influenced by the reaction of the unconscious. As a rule, he calls this the operation of conscience. But since the same psychic background produces reaction other than moral ones, the believer is measuring his conscience by the traditional ethical standard and thus by a collective value in which endeavor is assiduously supported by his church. So long as the individual can hold fast to his traditional beliefs and the circumstances of his time do not demand stronger emphasis on individual autonomy, he can rest content with the situation. But the situation is radically altered when the worldly-minded man, who is oriented to external factors, has lost his religious beliefs, appears en masse, as the case is today. The believer is then forced onto the defensive and must catechize himself on the foundation of his beliefs. He is no longer sustained by the tremendous suggestive power of the consensus omnium and is keenly aware of the weakening of the church and the precariousness of its dogmatic assumptions. To counter this, the church recommends more faith, as if this gift of grace dependent on man's goodwill and pleasure. The seat of faith, however, is not consciousness, but spontaneous religious experience, which brings the individual's faith into immediate relation with God. Here, each of us must ask, have I any religious experience and immediate relation to God, and hence that certainty which will keep me as an individual from dissolving into the crowd?
Perfect. That's that personal relationship with spirit, right? Not a collective relationship that he's saying this is what we need. Which is funny because he's such a Christian person, Jung, but he does criticize the church a lot, which is refreshing from someone who is so kind of entrenched in that religion itself.
But he's also building his case, right? From the dissociation and the neurotic of the individual and really putting the blame on society. If the individual lives in a neurotic society, in the dissociated society, that's because he is dissociated. And in order to overcome his dissociation, he needs to understand that there's under the side of himself, which at the beginning is called shadow. And so the shadow side of the personality that I project on others, I need to realize that it's within me in my unconscious, and I need to give it a voice. And when I give it a voice, then that shadow transformed into the inner God, which is really the basic of Jungian psychology, is to realize that I got to do the work of integrate the shadow, and then I can have a relationship with the unconscious, and the unconscious is the world of God. And Jung never said, this is the way or that's the way, or I'm a messiah and this is the way. He said, you go and you do your own inner work through your dreams and through your spiritual practice to discover what that is for you inside of you and develop a relationship with it within. But we extrovert our spiritual practices instead of introverting them. And so then we have that spiritual bypassing that's going on.
Oh, and we repress the instincts as well, rather than, like, there's a certain amount that you have to do that in society, which was he was pointing at before. But if you just repress wholesale and don't like give them a voice in another way, that's when this neurosis pops up. And even Freud said, like later with his id, like the id is actually the part of where their real instincts are coming from. And it's actually like the super ego that has kind of started censoring them again for society and all these other things, right? Through your parents and whatever else. And that the id isn't actually this bestial side, but it's actually the best parts of man, is what he later came to say, right? So,
right.
Interesting. They kind of complement each other when you know them from, their separate situations. Freud and Jung, it's not such a conflict as it is put out to be by like modern day Jungians and stuff like that as well, right?
Well, what Jung said about man being, modern man being unhistorical, we don't really understand psychology per se the way Freud and Adler and Jung and the modern effort of the youngest science and what Jung contributed, I mean, Jung at one point, he says that if you think that psychic problems come from chemical imbalance in your brain, says your ideas are in the 19th century, and so if you told that to a modern psychiatrist, or that's not what they teach in universities, right? They teach that everything is chemicals and there's no psyche, there's no soul, and you don't have to face that outer part, that inner part of yourself. You can just project your shadow and that's fine. And so then we live in a world of conflict, and to heal one has to, in essence, develop a religious attitude, in the sense of the Greek, the word religare, to get to know yourself and your connection with your instinct, but also to the cause of this world. And so really a basically introverted attitude. And it's interesting how we picture introverts as neurotics, but really we have very little idea of what it means to have a very good introverted practice. And so Jung is definitely pointing us in that direction. The next chapter is going to be, so we finished with the philosophical and the psychological approach to life. And the next chapter, chapter 6, is self-knowledge, which we'll do next week. How was this for you, Luke?
Yeah, it was pretty good, I think. It wasn't as many digressions as I thought. It's kind of, he explains it fairly well himself, obviously. So it was kind of nice. It flowed pretty well, I think.
Yes, I thought so too. And really sticking to the ideas of what Jung, because that's what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to bring out Jung's ideas and make it more palatable to a modern man who doesn't really know, even for us, some of the language that he uses is really difficult. So our ability to kind of translate it into a modern language is not no small attempt, and we take up the task knowing fully well that we're not really that qualified to do so, but we're driven to do so by our spirit, huh?
Well, yeah, and to having his terms explained too. Like I have a Jungian dictionary that explains a lot of his terms, which make things clear. But that's why I was bringing up Ian McGilchrist, because he's a modern day neuroscientist who is talking about this left and right brain, and he's top brass, right? And it helps bring Jung into a modern context. And same with even The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Saz. Like that's one of these top books that should be on people's shelves, and he goes into the very same thing, right? It's not chemicals in the brain,
Right, right.
so that's
Fun,
for a
fun,
whole nother
fun. All
day.
right. Well, we'll do it again next week.
Right on, sounds good.
MC Starman, Luke Renda, thanks for joining us. Please do subscribe to our channels. This is how we grow. Comments, ask questions. We need your feedback, and onward and upwards. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Peace out.